Great, I think we can get started. A few more people will trickle in, but I've got colleagues waiting at the top of the building, so hopefully they'll be able to direct them to the right place. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. We're really pleased to have you all here for the event called No Turning Back, the Fight for Asylum in the United States. This event is co-hosted by the Zolberg Institute and the Global Strategic Litigation Council. The purpose of the event is to bring together lawyers and advocates to discuss a case heard before the United Supreme Court last month, as well as the No Turning Back campaign, and what this all might mean for the future of asylum in the US and beyond. At its core, the case Noem v. Otro Lado is about whether people fleeing persecution will be able to seek protection at the US border. More specifically, it challenges the US government's former turnback policy, which prevented people from accessing asylum at ports of entry. During our panel's discussion, we hope to explore the importance of the case and the No Turning Back campaign and inspire you to get involved in defending refugee rights in the US and beyond. I also just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that today is the Holocaust Remembrance Day, and we honor the millions of lives lost and recognize how that genocide led to the global refugee protection frameworks that we rely on today and are central to this case. We carry forward never again and hold space for all those fleeing persecution and atrocities today as well. We hope to leave at least 30 minutes for Q&A at the end of the discussion, so please do think of any questions you'd like to ask along the way, and we'll have time for that at the end. We also hope to close by 7 p.m. I really appreciate you all coming when it's such a sunny spring day in New York finally. So thank you for your time, and we hope to close to get outside while there's still daylight. I should note that before we dive into discussion, I'll start by giving a very short introduction to myself, the council, and our brilliant panelists here today. They're all incredible advocates and leaders, and I've had the privilege to work with many of them very closely and hope to work with all of them more in the future. I also see a few familiar faces in the audience, including Amali, who just walked in. So thank you so much for joining us, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion afterwards too. So for those of you who don't know me, my name's Bella. I'm a lawyer in New York and also the UK, and I'm director of the Global Strategic Litigation Council, which we tend to call the Council for short. The Council unites and supports a coalition of over 700 organizations, advocates, and refugee leaders across the world. Together, we use the power of the people and the power of the law to advance the rights of displaced communities. Our global team and coalition work with and for migrants and refugees on high-impact litigation and advocacy to both protect human rights and stop harmful policies. In relation to this case, the Council intervened as amicus curiae alongside 45 other refugee rights organizations and 95 academics. For those less familiar with legal jargon, an amicus, or a friend of the court, is a party that isn't directly involved in the case, but provides expertise or perspective to help inform the court's decision. In a case like this, it's one of the key ways that broader legal, academic, policy, and human impact perspectives are brought before the court. The Council is also working to help amplify the brilliant No Turning Back campaign and other initiatives to protect the right to seek asylum in the US. In the interest of time and getting into the substance of today's discussion, I'll keep these introductions to our brilliant panelists brief. They definitely don't do justice to how extraordinary this group here today is, and I'd really encourage you to look at their full bios on our event website afterwards if you haven't done so already. So in terms of the wonderful panelists we have here today, and I'll just get you to wave as I introduce you, we're very lucky to be joined by key individuals who worked on the case and amicus interventions. So we have Melissa Crow, Director of Litigation at the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies. Melissa is on the team of co-counsel who represented the NGO Otro Lado in the case against the government and also spearheaded the No Turning Back campaign, which we'll hear more about later. Angelo Guisado, Senior Staff Attorney at the Center for Constitutional Rights, who was also co-counsel for Otro Lado alongside Melissa. Scott Busby, Senior Advisor at Human Rights First, and Distinguished Fellow at the Human Rights Institute of Georgetown University Law Center. Scott is joining us today in his capacity as a former government official, and he was part of an amicus brief filed by former senior officials raising policy concerns about the former turnback policy at the heart of this case. Anwin Hughes, Senior Director at Human Rights First. Human Rights First also intervened as amicus in the case alongside other human rights NGOs. Their focus was evidencing the human impact of the government's former policy. And we have Leah Zamo, a Senior Research Fellow at the Zolberg Institute. Leah and I were part of the core drafting team for an amicus submitted by the Council, together with 144 other organizations and academics, setting out how the policy violates international law. We're also really fortunate to be joined by two incredible individuals affiliated with the Refugee Storytellers Collective, who will share their personal perspectives on the importance of the right to seek asylum. This includes Teddy Al-Muqtad, a digital storyteller and founder of SALT, a platform amplifying LGBTQ+ Southeast Asian voices. As a queer Muslim from Indonesia, Teddy's work explores storytelling as a tool for visibility, belonging, and community building across diaspora spaces. And we also have Stephen Mulene, founder and director of African Queer Voices, a nonprofit dedicated to amplifying the voices of African LGBTQ+ individuals through storytelling, arts-based advocacy, and community engagement. His work focuses on forced displacement, asylum access, and advancing the rights and visibility of the LGBTQ community globally. We'll now start off with the panel discussion, and we'll have a series of questions for each of our speakers. So firstly, for Teddy. Hi, Teddy. So you should be able to turn on the microwave. Sorry, turn on the microphone. It just said turn on the microwave. I must be very hungry. Got to have lunch today.
Hello.
Hi, Teddy. No, British bumbling, this is really kicking in. So for Teddy, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really grateful, in particular to you and Stephen, for sharing your experience and time with us. To set the scene for everyone, we wanted to start by asking you if you could share why protecting access to asylum is so important based on your personal experience navigating the US asylum system. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's very personal for me. Well, first of all, hi everyone. My name is Teddy Al-Muqtadi. I am originally from Aceh, Indonesia. You might know my country is really beautiful, beautiful island, beautiful people, but not for people like me. Being gay and coming from a province that adapted Sharia law, the only province in Indonesia who adapted Islamic law. I mean, like people I'm in America when Mamdani got elected, they trying to like mocking Sharia law, Sharia law. I lived there for whole of my life. So being overly queer and Muslim means I'm gonna be bad there. So 10 years ago, I met my beautiful husband, and we moved here 5 years ago. We seeking asylum. We didn't know that moving here will be the biggest anxiety that always hit me day by day after the new government coming. First of all, they trying really hard to attack people like us, immigrant, asylum seeker, refugee. They trying to uh, give us or charge the asylum pending cases for $102. I mean, not everyone in a good financial right now. 102 for I know it's not a amount of money like a big money, but it's annually. But for some people, it's still hard, and they trying. This is a really close one for me. They trying to make it working permit shorter from 5 years to 18 months. And when we apply for a new card, we're waiting for 1 year. Can you imagine, like after the card coming, we need to reapply again for renew it. So protecting cases to asylum means anything beyond the policies for people like me. So it's more than just protecting. It's like people like me or Stephen, we can live without fear, not just for surviving, but to live peacefully. Thank you so much. I'm sorry for shaking it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Teddy. It's really brilliant to have you here today, and I'm grateful for you sharing your story and the importance of asylum with us all to frame the conversation. We're now going to turn to Angelo, and we're really grateful to have you, Angelo and Melissa, here representing CCR and CGRS, who brought the importance case on behalf of Otro Lado. For those less familiar with the case, can you briefly explain in simple terms what's at stake in Noem v. Otro Lado and why this case matters right now?
Thank you, Bella. Hi, everyone. Angelo Guisado, he, him. I'm a senior staff attorney at the Center for Constitutional Rights. Thank you for sharing part of your story, Teddy. It's stories like those that drove us to file the case on behalf of Otro Lado back in 2017. And that case involved a challenge to the metering policy, which, as we argued, unlawfully prevented asylum seekers from being able to present at a port of entry in violation of two federal statutes, the Constitution and the international norm of non-refoulement. The metering policy was one assault of many on migration generally and asylum seeking rights specifically, going into some of the details that Teddy shared. This case was brought on behalf of about a dozen asylum seekers in the organization Otro Lado, which helps asylum seekers try and access a chance at asylum and a meaningful and safe life in our country, which I thought the United States still believed in. And over the course of the last 9 years, in which there have been so many iterations of litigation, extant challenges to stuff like CBP-1 and the asylum cooperation agreements and the third country ban, we actually had a resounding victory in the San Diego federal court in 2021. And then we defended that ruling up on appeal essentially twice at the Ninth Circuit thereafter. And we just argued at the US Supreme Court a couple of weeks ago, alleging and arguing that asylum seekers at the precipice of entry have the right to knock on the door and say, I would like to be inspected and processed before they come find me and kill me. And that's indeed what happens on the US-Mexico border every day. So many of our clients were turned away in the most cruel and needless fashion. One of our clients, Bianca Doe, who was a trans woman, could not wait on the wait list that the metering system had imposed, had to climb over the border wall only to be encountered by a US official who, instead of sending her back to Mexico, watched her and forced her climb back over the border wall. This case has been and this policy has been particularly cruel to Black migrants. That's why we partnered with the Haitian Bridge Alliance to file subsequent challenges to the various offshoots of the metering policy. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I did want to discuss just very briefly, like the theoretical issues here that have such practical consequences and profound. Do countries have a duty to admit the tired, huddled masses who are fleeing persecution on their doorstep? And international law has said resoundingly yes, specifically and especially at the border. And international law has made that an integral part of the norm of non-refoulement. If you get to a country's gate and interact with an officer, they have to inspect and process you. That doesn't mean that you're supposed to get a rubber stamp asylum claim, but they at least have to hear you before they send you back to your persecutors or new persecutors whom they had no idea existed. And that's very much the reality of the US-Mexico border now. Various governments under multiple administrations have closed every available avenue. There's almost no functional way to seek asylum now at the US-Mexico border. The border is scary, it is dangerous. Migrants are very much ripe for picking from the cartel, and that has happened to a number of people I've spoken with in my trips to the US-Mexico border. And the United States, I feel like, and we can talk about this a little later, is doing that intentionally because it knows that the border itself is a kind of liminal space where certain people who assert rights can be rendered rightless. They see people with little recourse to lawyers, to money, to time, who are in the most dire straits imaginable, and they've decided to erect some sort of fortress, physical and metaphysical. The idea that the country can just, like a medieval fortress, close the gate to everyone else has tremendous consequences for the global rule of law, and just demonstrates remarkable and gratuitous cruelty and moral fraud. And it's a really sad case. And we're hopeful at the Supreme Court, but we can talk about that later.
Thank you so much, Angela. And for Anwen, 9 amicus briefs were submitted in this case in support of the right to seek asylum. Your brief, together with Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and Physicians for Human Rights, focused on the human impact and in particular the harms caused by this policy. Would you be able to share some stories covered in your brief and the importance of highlighting these to the Supreme Court?
Sure. Oh, that's fine. You just move the entire contraption. Okay. Can people hear me?
I think you might need to turn it. You might have to turn it on.
Sorry.
And the microwave on, as I said at the beginning.
Okay, wonderful. That sounds even better. Yeah. Right. So Human Rights First had been involved in doing a bunch of documentation work on the impact of a range of border policies under the Trump administration, the Biden administration, that were preventing people from accessing asylum at the border in a normal way. And this metering policy was, in a sense, the granddaddy of those policies, at least one of the earlier ones. Because we continued this process, this reporting for a while, and this documentation work for a while, we ended up speaking with or interviewing people about or representing a lot of asylum seekers who actually endured at various times different ones of these policies. So you had people who, were prevented from accessing the border because of metering. And then when they finally were able to get to the border, they were then turned back to Mexico under the Remain in Mexico policy, which was in effect by the time. So one of the striking things to me, I think, is the extent to which it's been a legal obstacle for us down there for several years now. And I mean, I'm old enough to remember a time when asylum seekers would come to the United, and I mean like fairly ordinary asylum seekers, not members of the global elite, right? Just like ordinary people facing persecution could come to the United States like normal people on commercial aircraft, right? And because of 9/11 and increased security in aviation and biometric passports and all these other things, which certainly have, things to recommend them, but also have significant downsides for people who need to get somewhere in a way that's not necessarily totally regular. The US-Mexico border has become a much bigger fact in our lives as refugee lawyers than it was before, let's say 2003 to 2005, somewhere in there. The other reason for that is, of course, significant security problems in a number of Central American and Latin American countries that also peaked during the same period that we're talking about. Anyway, that's not responsive to your question, so let me respond to your question. I think, I can mention a few cases. One is actually mentioned in the brief, and 2 others are just from my own caseload because I was talking to them recently, so they're in front of mine. One was a woman from Honduras who was trying to seek protection in the United States after one of her children had been killed in Honduras. And this woman tried to make it to the border. I did, in fact, make it to the border, close enough to have an interaction with Customs and Border Protection 3 times, was turned back all 3 times. And after being turned back, she and her kids were kidnapped in Mexico. I think one of the things, and listen, you notice this listening to the oral argument in this case of the Supreme Court, is that I think it's very easy for courts who are understandably focused on issues of statutory interpretation not to necessarily and spontaneously grasp what this actually means for the people affected and the full range of harms that people are facing. So for example, there were the counsel for the government in oral argument repeatedly tried to make the point, did make the point that the United States was not sending anyone anywhere to face harm, right? That the US wasn't shipping anyone to a country where they were facing harm. And listening to this and having, worked with all the people to whom this had happened, it felt a bit unreal in the sense that, first of all, you don't actually have any idea what harm you're sending people to unless you're screening them, right? That's the whole point. You don't know. You don't know if the person is Mexican. You don't know if they're Honduran. You may be returning them right back to their country of persecution, which in the case of Mexicans is. And although some of these policies have actually, in theory, not covered Mexicans, even when they don't, what we've seen in practice is that Mexicans end up getting turned away along with everybody else. You also don't know, or you don't necessarily know from having spoken to the person, if you're not speaking to them, what specific risks they may be facing in Mexico. And one of the things about the metering policy that was particularly offensive was the way in which it fell with particular danger on people who were the most vulnerable, right? I mean, its administration was chaotic. I think you'll see this if you read the papers in the case. So that the US was turning people back. The US was not actually maintaining a coherent meter for most of this period. So there were a lot of local arrangements which refugees were left to figure out for themselves. Are you in the jurisdiction where the wait list is maintained by the guy in the cafe with the notebook? Are you in the jurisdiction where if you pay something more, you can maybe register? Are you in a region where if you're Black, you're just not getting on the wait list? It was people were left to figure this out experientially. And that was simply, for people who were able to feel as if they had actually gotten themselves onto, they were in the mythical bakery where they had the mythical number, right? That wasn't viable for a lot of people. So for example, I represented in 2019 a man who was detained here in New Jersey who had come seeking asylum from a country in Central Africa, and he had a really serious persecution claim. And what he also was having, though, by the time he got to Mexico, were a lot of health issues that he, I think, attributed to his past persecution because he'd started experiencing the symptoms after being detained in his own country. I think that wasn't necessarily the medical origin of them, but he was getting sicker and sicker as he was making his way towards the US border, and he couldn't get hospitals in Mexico to treat him. And he finally crossed the border without inspection because he was like, I can't wait. I can't, they were telling me it was going to be months before I could get an appointment to the port of entry. And I just can't survive here. I have no money. I've completely exhausted my resources, and I'm just feeling so bad. It was once he was in detention, and that was after weeks of not really dealing with his issues, that he was diagnosed with an advanced form of cancer. And so, this man is now an SIV, and he's alive, and that's a wonderful thing because it's many years later, and that was not prognosis, to be honest. But none of that would have been possible if he'd been left to wait, sleeping on the street because he couldn't get shelter and so forth. Two other clients were a mother and son team, so an older woman and her adult son. And these people the son had spent a career in law enforcement, and his mother had been a lifelong lay leader in the Catholic Church. These were very rules-oriented people, may I just say. And so crossing the border without inspection was not a choice that came naturally to them at all. But they, again, had no choice because they were both, he was in a situation where he was feeling very unsafe in northern Mexico because of his racial composition, which was unusual for that location. And she was an older person, and they were in a very unsafe state in northern Mexico. And so again, they then ended up crossing without inspection. He was then returned to Mexico under the Remain in Mexico policy, was eventually granted withholding of removal, having been denied asylum based on transit ban. I'm just reciting all these various policies that have been separately litigated. Sorry for any post-traumatic problems this is maybe causing any of my colleagues. And eventually, and having been granted withholding, was then booted back to Mexico anyway. Which we got him back in eventually, but it was a saga. And meanwhile, he got separated from his mother, who was detained in the separate detention center, eventually released. They were both eventually granted asylum. And so you wonder, what was all that for? All that human suffering? I mean, none of these obstacles are in any way merits-based, right? None of this has anything to do with the merits of anybody's asylum claim, which again, we have no idea of because we're not screening any of these people, right? So the other thing I just would say that I think also is a point that hopefully comes through in our amicus brief to an extent, and also in the earlier reporting that we were doing, is that the harms that people were facing in Mexico specifically, which did include in some cases forced return to their countries of origin, which were not Mexico, but those harms also feed on these illegal American policies. In other words, all of this US border enforcement creates these industries that feed off in Mexico, that feed off the vulnerability of people trying to seek asylum at the border. In other words, there's a whole, I mean, I'm also old enough to remember when it was possible to cross the US border much more easily, illegally, I mean, right? And I'm not recommending that, but I'm just saying it used to be a less dangerous experience than it has become, right? And part of the reason it's become so dangerous is because you now have, you have cartels who prey on, and other criminal actors in Mexico who prey on migrants, who target migrants specifically for harm. And they're very easy to identify if they're being forced to congregate basically in these particularly unsafe northern border areas because of the lack of access. Sorry, that was all I should not.
No, that was excellent. Thank you so much, Anna, and for also showing the historical perspective on how much more difficult it's become. And I completely agree with you on the lack of merits-based assessment or decisions that the government keeps on making over and over again that are really harming individuals. We're now going to turn to Scott, and it was significant, Scott, that you and other former government officials chose to share your concerns about the government's position before the court. Can you tell us why a group of former government officials decided to file an amicus brief in this case? And what are the key aspects of the case that drove you and others to intervene?
Thank you, Bella, and thanks to the Global Council for organizing this session. So there were 13 of us, former senior government officials, who had served in a variety of agencies. Some of us were old enough to have actually worked for the Immigration and Naturalization Service, which preceded the current Department of Homeland Security. Others had worked in the Department of State. Some had also worked in the Department of Health and Human Services. So we all had a practical experience implementing the asylum regime, the asylum laws for the past 3 decades and a half, more or less. And we were a mixture of Democratic and Republican political appointees on the one hand, and then civil servants like myself. I was not a political appointee ever. I was a civil servant who served in 6 different administrations. And I think significantly, 7 of the 13 were civil servants who had implemented asylum policy, who were part of this brief. Why did we decide to intervene in the case? First of all, I think we all felt that asylum is just integral to who we are as a country. You know, from the beginning of the United States, whether it was receiving Puritans or others, their concept of asylum, even if it wasn't always reflected in law, was just central to who we are as a country. And I think we felt most of us had entered government service, had gotten into this line of work because we believed in that fundamental concept. And of course, that idea has come to be reflected both in our becoming party to something called the 1967 Protocol relating to the status of refugees, the international instrument that the US is bound by, but also the asylum law that was enacted in 1980 as part of the 1980 Refugee Act. So that was the first reason, kind of a broad philosophical humanitarian commitment that we all felt. Secondly, and this has been alluded to already, we felt as a legal matter and as a historical matter, there were clearly opportunities for people both inside the country and knocking at the door, as Angelo described it, to apply for asylum. The law, the statutes define two different distinct categories of people. If you read or listen to the oral arguments, you'll hear lots of argumentation about, well, who exactly are these two different categories of people? The government's position is basically that they're more or less the same. The contrary position is that there must be a reason that there are two categories of people, both people who are inside the country and people who are knocking at the door. And over the course of our own experience implementing the law and procedures, we defined these, we treated these two categories differently. So we felt like we've been implementing the law and the regulations according to the notion that people have a right to put forward their claims at the border, as well as if they are inside the country. And we felt that the government's position in this case contravened that history. Those of us who had experience in the Department of State also felt that the very principle that someone knocking at the door should be entitled to have his or her claim heard is integral to the international refugee system. Ever since World War II, of course, and the development of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1951 Convention relating to status of refugees, and its 1967 protocol, the idea that countries have some duty to provide protection to those who are seeking it is kind of fundamental to our international regime. And if the United States, still the most powerful country in the world, says, no, we can just stop people before they get to us and thereby prevent them from claiming asylum. If the United States can do that, then other countries can do it as well. And this has been an idea that has been debated forever among governments. And there are lots of governments in the world, like in Thailand or in Turkey or many different places, who have done that, who have stopped people from coming in. Not always, but it's a fundamental instinct of a lot of governments to do that. So if the United States is doing it, all of these other governments will feel entitled to do the same. And last but not least, we felt that the turnback policy was inhumane for the reasons that Anwin described, and counterproductive. And Anwin has already alluded to this fact, that by turning people away who come to a port of entry claiming asylum, by turning them away, you create this perverse incentive for them to enter illegally. So you're thwarting the goal of any US administration to get immigrants, would-be immigrants, to comply with the law. You're creating incentive for them to circumvent ports of entry, to circumvent regular procedures and processes. Those are the reasons that we intervened. We also wanted to make clear that we're not arguing for open borders. We as government officials, of course, were responsible for enforcing borders largely. So we're not saying, oh, you have to let everyone in, but we think there are tools at the government's disposal that can be used to manage problems like this. There are resources that can and should be spent on adjudicators, be they asylum officers or immigration judges. There is an expedited removal procedure, which is controversial and has not been always implemented in a proper and fair way, but there are streamlined procedures Congress has created that can be used in crisis situations. And we think the government needs to look at that as well, and developing capacity at the border to hold people while these streamlined procedures are being implemented. So that was why we got involved in the case and wanted to make our voices heard.
Thank you so much, Scott. That's a really helpful overview, and I noted down a kind of quote from your brief that said the government's extraordinary turnback policy at issue here is contrary to US law and flouts our country's most profound values and international commitments. And I really do feel that way, and that brings us nicely on to Leah. This case has been described as landmark and capable of shaping the future of asylum in the US, but also beyond. And our brief highlighted key aspects of international law that the scheme violates, which a number of speakers have referenced. It also showed how the US would become a global outlier if the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the government and said that one couldn't seek asylum at the border. So based on our brief, in the simplest of terms, can you share why this case is so important for the future of global migration, not just in the US?
Yeah, no problem. The simplest terms, we will see. So building on what several of the panelists have explained very well. So just for anyone who may not know, the non-refoulement is a sort of fancy French word. It's more or less the only French word that I know. Which means essentially it's an international legal obligation not to send somebody back to persecution or where their life or freedom would be threatened. And there's different sort of definitions and scopes, which is part of what I'm going to get into about kind of the living and breathingness of international law around non-refoulement. But it is a prohibition. You cannot send people back to danger. You must at some level take them into at least assess them. And so that is in many ways part of the historiography of how we got to this case. Unfortunately, the international legal aspects of this case do not seem to be front and center, and Angelo could and Melissa could correct me, but I don't think the Ninth Circuit got into this too much. I don't think the hearing got into this one. Our brief, though, was very much focused on this. So that's what I want to talk about, which is that the United States' first obligation when it comes to these things, before it had the two statutes that Angelo had mentioned. Of course, the Constitution predates this, but it's a living document in and of itself, was the 1951 Convention. The U.S., as Scott referenced, signed on to the 1967 Protocol, which means it absorbed the 1951, neither here nor there. But what I want to say is, first of all, that non-refoulement is a fundamental norm under international law, but it has a complicated history. And part of the issue is that when the drafters of the 1951 Convention, at the conferences of which the United States itself was the superpower already, this was right after World War II, this was right after basically, sort of the British Empire was on the decline and the US Empire was on the upswing, and we really held sway in these negotiations. And there was a big debate. The scholars call it a big debate between the United States and France. It was a bigger debate about that, but it was essentially about how broad were the commitments that member states were going to be signing on to when they signed on to codified, et cetera, the Refugee Convention, the 1951 Refugee Convention. The two debates were essentially around the definition of refugee, which is Article 1, and then Article 33, which is the non-refoulement article. And there was a big issue, and this issue I think is still live today, even though it's not often discussed, but is that at the time when they were drafting the 1951 Convention, they were worried about what's called the residual caseload. It was a population of displaced people in Europe, mostly in Central Europe. And the definition of refugee that they put into Article 1 to define a refugee was people displaced in Europe prior to 1951. And so this was very much a Eurocentric document. It excluded every other displaced population. Even if they were displaced by World War II, it excluded them. So it was very much focused on a very specific population. Now, why this matters, this matters for sort of the historiography of international law in general, but it matters for non-refoulement because what it meant was that they had a population, this residual caseload, so-called, that was already in the country of asylum. So the original 1951 convention said nothing about how do you get from A to Z? What are the rights of people on the move? What are the rights of people at the border? What are the rights of people that have not already been in a country of asylum? The 1951 convention was constructed along with UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, which was given a 3-year mandate and a budget of $300,000, and it was told to solve the post-war Europe refugee problem, which is the lingo that they use at the time. So the convention itself was never supposed to be a global convention. It was never supposed to play the role that it is now being asked to play. And so this filtered into the text of it. So you had at the beginning quite a narrow sort of refugee regime, as we now call it, and it didn't actually tackle this problem. It had non-refoulement. This was the beginning of the Cold War. You had by 1951 a concern on the Western power side that most refugees, because you had to be a European, were essentially white men who were able to get across the Iron Curtain, and it was politically non-feasible, and there was no sort of political impetus to actually send them back. So non-refoulement, this idea that we won't send them back, had sort of symbolic political power. And that lasted most of the Cold War. And in fact, in the US, the definition of refugee was someone fleeing communism until 1980. So there's a kind of political and geopolitical symbolism around this idea of the definition of refugee and non-refoulement. Now, what happened in between there, though, was that lawyers got very creative. And so this sort of central contradiction within the 1951 convention, which essentially presupposes that you're already in a place of asylum, and so it doesn't give you a right to seek asylum. In fact, the right to seek asylum is only in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, Article 14, which is a authoritative but non-binding General Assembly resolution. It's not in the 1951 convention. There is no right to seek asylum in the 1951 convention. But so what happened in between and on the way was that non-refoulement became the center of refugee protection, because there was no right to enter a country, but there was a right to not be returned if you could enter. And lawyers got creative, governments got creative, and what we've seen, and if you look at, for instance, the African Union has a much more expansive definition, not only of refugee, but of non-refoulement. Same thing in Latin America, same thing in sort of at the regional level. And that started to play into how we interpret 1951 itself, including Article 33, including non-refoulement. Same thing started to happen in the United States. Same thing, there was a series of cases that started to say that this norm needs to expand. One of the main ways that it has expanded is the idea that it is an extraterritorial obligation. Now, there's a Supreme Court case in the early 90s that says, which is, getting to this idea that the US is an outlier. It's been a bit of an outlier for a while. It was the predominant drafter of the 1951 convention, and partly why the refugee definition and non-refoulement was drafted quite narrowly. The rest of the world pushed and expanded it. The US Supreme Court has been playing a certain role on that. But it has been expanded, and just like we think of the Constitution as a living document, we think of the 1951 Convention, the 67 Protocol as a living document. So this has been expanded, but there's a pushback. There's a backlash, essentially, which is what we're seeing now. And so when we're thinking globally about asylum, the traditional asylum states, not just in the United States, not just in North America, in Europe, in other parts of the world, are essentially saying that asylum is dead, that they're externalizing. We already know that the vast majority of people fleeing persecution or conflict are already in the global south. They're not coming to the north, but the north is essentially shutting its borders anyway. And so we're seeing this what do we call it, containment, deterrence, externalization. This is kind of a global phenomenon. And this case is very much about pushing back on that. The United States has adopted the 1967 protocol, which means essentially it's adopted the 1951 protocol, and has through that adopted the interpretation of that, the expanded interpretation of that. I don't think that the case is actually gonna end up hinging on any international legal issues. So our amicus brief is mainly like putting on record that this is an obligation, that this treaty is part of the law of the land within the United States, but it is definitely part of a broader global phenomenon, a kind of backlash. With every backlash, I don't know what the antonym of backlash is, a front lash. Anyway, other parts of the world are stepping up. And I think we'll get into that in the sort of, the hope for the future on this. But just to say that there's a complicated legal history here. The United States has been putting its thumb on this history for a very long time. The rest of the world has been working to essentially push for a more egalitarian, a more expansive, more post-colonial definition. That definition is now pretty bedrocked into international law, which makes the US an outlier. And we're about to become even more of an outlier. The hope and the concern and the risk, of course, is that the precedent set here will be either seen as an outlier or as a kind of a way in for other countries to follow suit.
Thank you so much, Leah. That was a really clear history of the convention and the importance of our brief and the hope that the US remains an outlier or joins the rest of the world. So for Melissa now, Melissa, you've been leading, or CPRS has been leading something called the No Turning Back campaign alongside this case. Can you first just briefly introduce the campaign and what it is trying to achieve at this moment alongside the case? Looks like it's on testing.
Yeah. I would love to talk about the campaign, but I first want to say that I am truly sorry that the Supreme Court justices aren't here to absorb the amazing content in this panel and understand what the international standards were intended to do and the human effects and why former government officials stood up and spoke out against what the government was doing. Along with Angelo, I have had the privilege of representing our partners at Otro Lado, along with a class of literally thousands of courageous asylum-seeking plaintiffs since 2017. Angela mentioned that we filed on behalf of 13 individuals, which is absolutely true. A class was subsequently certified by the district court. And over the years that this policy was in effect, it impacted literally thousands, if not tens of thousands of lives. We've known from the beginning that there are limits to what can be achieved through litigation. And we have litigated with that in mind. The stakes and the challenges have never been more apparent than they are now under the current administration, which, as I'm sure all of you know, at every turn has sought to tip the scales of justice against immigrants and against asylum seekers more specifically. So in addition to honing our arguments for the justices, we knew that we had to take the fight outside the court to help people understand what the case is about and to lay the groundwork for whatever advocacy might be necessary after the court issues its decision. So a group of litigators and advocates and communications people came together and brainstormed. I think it was the weekend after Thanksgiving. And we decided to launch a dedicated public campaign under the banner of No Turning Back, which has been adopted as the title of panels and other endeavors. So this was obviously a reference to the inhumane turnback policy at the center of the case, and also a broader call to action. A call for the United States not to renege on its promises to refugees that Leah so adequately articulated, and not to turn its back on people seeking safety, like my co-panelists today. So the campaign was launched in late January, and we garnered support from dozens of partners, at the border, across the country, many of the amici who are here today and many others, frontline human rights defenders, and a very diverse coalition of faith-based organizations. And over the next few months, we worked together to educate the public about the case and also about what was at stake for people who were seeking safety, for the communities at the border, and for our legacy as a country that has held itself up as a safe haven for people fleeing persecution. We did all of the usual things like publishing explainers and holding countless press briefings, but we also worked really hard to lift up the voices of people who were directly impacted, including the plaintiffs in the case. We worked with a pro bono videographer who was based in the Rio Grande Valley on a video series featuring advocates who are working to protect the rights of asylum seekers at the border. And we worked really closely with our amicus partners, including those sitting here, to amplify the perspectives set forth in their briefs that we know not everyone is going to read. So we help them transform the legalese into op-eds and media interviews that really sounded the alarm on the administration's quite unprecedented attempts to shut down the asylum system. And I want to give a shout out particularly to Scott and Mary Giovanoli and other officials who signed on to the brief, who worked on a really excellent piece that was published in Just Security. On the morning of oral argument, we partnered with the Cairo Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice, which also submitted an amicus brief. And they organized a really powerful interfaith vigil and rally on the steps of the Supreme Court that was particularly well attended, given that it was cold outside and it started at 8 in the morning. The whole experience was incredibly moving. Faith leaders and immigration advocates shared songs and poems and stories and prayers. And there were even some poets from the Refugee Storytellers Collective who spoke out in support of people seeking asylum at the border. Our partners from Otro Lado were there, numerous other frontline advocates were there. What was really sad is that despite our fundraising to make sure that some of our named plaintiffs could be there, they did not feel comfortable coming because of the current political climate. And this was really at odds with the way we have litigated the case over the past decade. And happy to talk more about that during questions. In a nutshell, Otro Lado had rightly insisted from the beginning that the plaintiff should be integrally involved in the case. And our partners at Otro Lado made sure that that happened. We were able to use the litigation process in conjunction with other strategies, not only to fight in the courts, but to mobilize and empower and foster solidarity among the people whose lives were at stake here, on both sides of the border. We have a number of weeks, maybe months ahead of us as we await the decision from the court. And we're going to continue all of these efforts, educational advocacy, and so forth. We're also very focused on our allies on Capitol Hill, including those Democratic lawmakers who filed an amicus brief in the case. Because however the court decides, we want the Hill to be prepared to respond and to present an alternative vision for a path forward that protects the rights of asylum seekers, and if necessary, clarifies those rights. When the decision's issued, our team will be ready to unpack the ruling, explain what it does, what it doesn't do, and what the consequences are. In the meantime, I encourage you to visit our website, which is very easy to remember. It is asylumsaveslives.org. And there you can learn more about our case. You can receive updates and calls to action and learn more about how you can plug into the campaign and participate in welcoming asylum seekers, either at the border or your own community. Lots of need for volunteers and also, of course, donations. The movement to protect asylum rights does not begin or end at the Supreme Court. And no matter what happens, we will keep fighting, and we urge you to join us in this very important fight. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Melissa, for that really powerful intervention. And I'm always reminded of this book that I read called The Revolution Will Not Be Litigated. And I think it's fundamentally important that we continue advocacy, particularly when litigation isn't always working at the moment, and we maintain grassroots activism and campaigning and policy work alongside our legal work to affect change. And that's true both in the US and in the different jurisdictions that we work in around the world. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I really encourage everyone to go to asylumsavelives.org and get involved with the campaign and local community organizing work. So I now have a question for Stephen. Thank you so much for joining us, Stephen. And I wanted to ask, what do you want the US asylum system to be like, drawing on your experience and how it has impacted you? And as practitioners and advocates, what should we all be focusing on to support people who are seeking asylum now?
Thank you. From my experience, as a queer man from Uganda seeking asylum in the US, it's not just the legal process, but the uncertainty, the waiting period of time, and how sometimes you feel you are not even seen, you are not important in the community. I came to the US in 2023 after Uganda passed the anti-gay law, which is one of the harshest anti-gay laws in the world. And until today, I've never received a decision about my asylum case, nor have I been invited for the interview. So you can imagine, you are just there like a dummy, and you can't tell what's going to happen the next day. While I'm grateful for a few things like having a work permit, and of course the best documentation for me to navigate here and there, but again, just like any other person, it's very difficult even to get employed, to find jobs out there, and even finding a community is difficult, And so these are all things that come to play as you're waiting for your case to be determined, whether you're fit for asylum or not. And it's something someone cannot just, be there to celebrate about or to have a clear direction on what's going to happen to you. And despite all these, despite all this process for me waiting for my decision, I've been able to build my life here. I was able to open up and register a non-profit organization which supports others that are navigating a displacement. But again, these are all things we do for us to try finding community, while you're waiting for your case. And it takes the courage for you to wait and wait and wait. I want to say, like, no one leaves their home that is peaceful to come to uncertainty environments. You know, we all flee our countries coming here to seek for safety because back home there it's chaotic, you know. And so coming here and find the same chaos, it leaves you in a very awkward state. And many times I've tried to withdraw my case and maybe move to a different country. But every time even you think about moving from the US maybe to Europe, again starting from scratch, you know, the years you've been here waiting and waiting. So these experiences are really traumatic, and you can never understand them unless you're in that, you know, process. And a few people like myself who can speak about them, but majority don't even speak about them. People are dying in silence here while seeking for safety, you know. People are breaking down every now and then, and they can't do anything about that. They just have to trust the system that is failing to decide what happens to them next time. You asked whether I mean how I want the system to be like. I would want a system, one that is treats people with dignity, one that doesn't make people wait in limbo for many years. You know, that's the kind of system I would want to see. And I want to see a system whereby seeking legal support is a right and not just, you know, I want a system that is where you're seeking, a system whereby seeking legal support, you know, is available to anyone regardless of their background and stuff like that. But not a system that dictates who gets protected, who is sent back home because of, you know, several, you know, instances and stuff like that. But also for practitioners and advocates who are here and in the audience there, I think the focus must be centered on lived experiences, trying to expand access to legal, but also building communities for people seeking asylum in the United States. That would be my call for them to do in support of people fleeing persecution and being here, having to wait for many years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for sharing your story and the challenges that you face even when within the US and waiting for asylum. It's really powerful to hear for your words, and I want you to know that you are important and you are seen, and it's really amazing that you're now working to help others as well, even when stuck in limbo. And we're really grateful for you being here today and for you being able to share your perspective and story. And I hope that we can all work together to create a system that is founded in dignity and humanity, as you said, and where protection is a right as it should be and not a privilege. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And thank you to all our wonderful panelists. I have a few more questions for panelists, but I thought we could turn to Q&A and then come back to them to engage the audience a bit. So if anyone in the audience has a question, I will come hand you the microphone and you can put your hand up. Yeah.
I have a question for Leah. I thought your explanation was like really well done, so thank you. You spoke about like these externalization policies and how asylum is essentially dead in much of the Western world. I'm curious if you could like share your opinion on these safe third country externalizing policies that kind of operate under the guise of burden sharing and kind of speak to whether or not these act essentially as a loophole that legalizes reboulement.
We'll take a few questions if anyone else wants to ask a question, sure.
Yeah, thank you all for being here. You mentioned that there is an emerging industry that profits off the vulnerabilities of people on the move at the border. And an example was the cartel. But I have another example in mind. Private contractors, usually private security companies or private military companies. Are they active at the US-Mexico border? If yes, what are the activities they engage with? And what are the transparency or accountability mechanisms available to tackle such human rights violations like that? Thank you.
Would anyone else like to ask a third question? Go back to our hands. Oh, one at the front area.
Thank you all so much. I am not a lawyer, just as a disclaimer. I also thought the explanation was extremely helpful. Thank you so much for that. I was wondering, in your all's experience, if there's room or has there been room to talk about the racial aspects of the xenophobia that's kind of inherently baked into a lot of these policies that exist, that like over time and space and across borders, that there seems to be this undertone of racism that exists within a lot of these policies. So I'm just curious, like how that shows up in your all's work. Is there room to push on that? And then for people who are outside of the legal space, how can we engage with some of those aspects of the work that you all do?
Thank you all so much for such a wonderful presentation. I learned a lot. My question is, because I run a social service agency in the Bronx and I work with immigrants. And when the last 2 years we had the influx of immigrants, we were at the center of that. But what I've been hearing in the immigrant communities is that there's too much influx of immigrants, the border should be closed. So my question to you is, what would you answer? What would you tell those immigrant communities? What would the response be? My second question is, for those of us who are not lawyers or who are not, with you guys there, what should we do to build awareness in our community that can support the work that you're doing?
Thank you so much to everyone for those questions. And we'll start with Leah, who the first question was directed to.
Oh, brilliant.
And have to show me this as well.
Okay, these are fabulous questions. I'm gonna leave most of them to my fellow panelists, but so on externalization and safe third countries. So for folks who may not know, so you have non-refoulement, which is an international obligation, and you have in essence a regime that is continuing to find ways to get around that if not violated in outright. And safe third country agreements, so-called, are one way to do that. So what these are, so if somebody comes and applies for asylum, for instance, in the United States is aware that they cannot send them back to their home country because that might violate non-refoulement. So they send them willy-nilly to some other country that they have perhaps they've never been to, they have no attachment to, et cetera, and so forth. We're seeing these proliferate. These are not new. And there's especially in Europe, with the European Court of Human Rights, there's an entire kind of legal regime around the definition of safe country. And, for instance, whether Greece is considered a safe country, if Sweden can send people to Greece, et cetera, and so forth. There's a lot of case law on this. That's now essentially being broken down in the same way that the overall architecture seems to be being broken down. And so we're seeing a proliferation of these kinds of agreements. So people are being sent from the United States that have never stepped foot in a country to that country. It's a way to say, well, no, but we're abiding by the prohibition on refoulement. But we are, doing something else. These agreements are now increasingly under the current administration being attached to other things. So for instance, there's now agreements with certain states where these agreements are now being tied to mineral mining and rare earths and sort of other kind of trade issues that the United States is under. So it's a very politicized environment, which I think this environment has been politicized for a very long time, but we're seeing a new confrontation of it. So we're going to need a kind of united front around investigating, pushing back on these kinds of third country agreements. This is somewhat separate from otherwise sort of traditional deportation, but it's all being messed up into one big kind of conflagration. And there's a lack of access to courts around these things. There's a lack of what we're going to need, I think, is another Supreme Court case on this, although we have to be worried about where that may land, essentially. But there's other countries that are fighting against this. Hopeful that world politics are shifting quickly at the moment, and there may be a rebuke to this, because the countries on the receiving end of these agreements don't want to be on them. They're just being more or less pressured into them.
Yeah, go for it, Melissa. Oh yeah, go on.
I just want to add one point, which is that in some of the cases that we're talking about, the agreements are actually not safe third country agreements. It is permissible under the Immigration and Nationality Act to send somebody back to a truly safe third country, which means that there is a fair and functioning asylum or protection system in that country. The government is using a different name for these agreements. They call them Asylum Cooperative Agreements, or ACAs. And we are suing about the use of those agreements. I can't remember who I'm suing on what with whom, but yes, someone is also involved in that lawsuit. Interestingly, the one thing that we really need to push this lawsuit forward is the designations by the Attorney General that these countries do have full and fair and functioning asylum systems. And the government has come up with any number of reasons why they don't have to or can't or won't provide those agreements. So we're trying to find another way at the moment.
And
Go on, Emma.
sorry, to your question about should return these things to their homes. Okay. To your question about whether these agreements are looked from law by another name. I mean, I think one of the enormous concerns here is that, first of all, that the US has been concluding agreements of this kind with some countries that are pretty actively unsafe, at least for certain types of asylum seekers, and with some countries that are quite unsafe in general. And that because there's no, the actual safe third country agreement, the only one the United States has is with Canada, and there's also litigation about that at the moment, but that has been for the last 10 years. But that at least is, first of all, it's reciprocal. In other words, you're subject to that if you came to Canada through the United States or vice versa. And the idea is that the country that you approach the border from is going to be the country responsible for your adjudication of your asylum claim. But because these countries don't have capacity to process the numbers of people that they could potentially be hosting under the asylum cooperative agreements, and also because in many cases these things seem to have been concluded with basically no reception infrastructure, there's a real concern that people are going to end up just completely stuck, fish out of water, and that under those incredibly difficult circumstances, they're going to have no choice but to go back to their countries of origin. Because, at some point, this is about physical and psychological survival, right? And that there are different types of threats that you can face to that.
Yeah, and I just said that we've been working both to support US litigation on this matter, but also with our lawyers based in other countries receiving these groups of individuals who seem to be completely randomly selected, and many of them have withholding of removal and being removed to countries that they have no connection to, like Equatorial Guinea, for example, and then held in detention there, and kind of pressured, as Anwen alluded to go back to their country of origin. And so we are often referring to it as shameful in many cases, because that's what it effectively is. And Costa Rica, different courts have been ruling against it. The Constitutional Court of Costa Rica issued a really powerful judgment against the US's against Costa Rica being involved with the US in the removal of 200 migrants from all around the world to Costa Rica. But now the Costa Rican government has signed a bilateral agreement with the US to receive 25 individuals each week. And at the moment, 25 came over the weekend, and our local lawyer in Costa Rica and the local organizations we're working with have not even been able to have access to the individuals or understand their needs. And we're really worried that they're being pressured by the IOM and potentially other government officials to return to their countries of origin, even though it might unlikely it's not safe for them to do so. And the conditions that these people have been put in are just absolutely horrific. But there is this kind of mass resistance working resistance outside of the US in the receiving countries to fight against it. And my colleague Beatrice, who's our regional litigator for Africa and is based in Nairobi, she's just started a group with African lawyers working on the issue of US externalization agreements, called the African Coalition Against Externalization. So it's the ACE to ICE. And she's working to kind of collaborate with lawyers to challenge these agreements on the receiving end, so that we can hopefully see a pushback from states who are often being pressured to enter these agreements and being given huge financial to them huge, to the US small financial packages and millions of dollars to enter into these agreements. And so we're hoping that we can both work within the US to challenge these not unsafe third country agreements, and also outside the US with a global coalition of lawyers led by kind of global South lawyers and leaders. So just wanted to add that on.
Could I split a hair and make a
Yeah,
comment? So
of
the hair
course.
splitting. So one of the things that is making the current state of affairs so confusing, including for refugees, I might add, at least the ones I'm speaking to, is that it's just the proliferation of different types of externalization agreements affecting different types of people. And so the type that Bella was just referring to is when the United States is taking people who have orders of removal from the United States, right, but cannot be removed to their home country for one reason or another, or perhaps they could, but the United States would rather not, for reasons best known to itself. That's a separate topic. But where the United States is instead sending them to a third country, not with the understanding that that third, or even the pretense that that third country will entertain a refugee claim from them necessarily, but simply that that country will take them off the United States' hands. And this goes a little bit to your question also. I mean, one of the things that's really disturbing about this is that is just the monetization of all of this. I mean, we already have migration, the migratory tail waving the foreign policy dog to a degree that is bizarre at the moment, I would say globally. But, essentially what is happening is the United States is extorting other countries or paying them a lot of money, or both, to get them to take people that the United States sees as non-human units in a sense. I mean, it's very hard for me to appreciate how you could do this to people that you actually saw as your fellow human beings in any meaningful sense. What we're going to pay you $5 million, and you're just going to take up to X number of people who and there may be some qualifications, like no one with criminal record, no unaccompanied minors, but sometimes it's just literally, we'll just send you a bunch of people, and we don't care what happens to them after that. We're not monitoring, we're not checking, we're claiming that we're not asking you to detain them in your maximum security prison, but we know that that's happening and we're not doing anything to stop it. So it's very shocking. Now, you also have these asylum cooperative agreements where the United States is sending people whose asylum claims it is choosing not to process. So people who don't have orders of removal yet, but who are told, listen, we're going to order you removed to this other country, on the assumption that that other people be able to file for asylum in that other country, and that gives rise to the problems that Melissa was mentioning for a second. But, part of the reason why there are so many people who are now facing removal to third countries because they've been granted, who, in these SOT, South Sudan, Equatorial Guinea, etc., especially the Equatorial Guinea and Cameroon instances, is because for a number of years now, the United States has been implementing other policies of questionable legality to prevent people whom it's recognizing as refugees, it's recognizing that not only would they, do they face persecution in their own countries, but their persecution would even be more likely than not. So that the high evidentiary threshold, the United States is not giving them full asylum. It's giving them a granted withholding and removal. It only protects them against removal to their own country. And then the Department of Homeland Security runs around saying, we have all these people and they have orders of removal. And this is a major enforcement crisis and we need to get rid of them. Well, they have orders of removal because you all implemented regulations that said that they couldn't get the full protections of asylum. Have you granted them the full protections of asylum, rather than discriminating against them based on their matter of entry or whatever other non-merits-based criteria those were, they would be green card holders. They would be voting in elections right now. They would be fine, and you wouldn't be able to frame them as this problem in need of a solution. So it's like this dynamic where first we create the problem, then we complain vociferously about the problem for political ends, and then we shell out enormous amounts of money to random other countries from which we want things in order to send people there. And it's extremely twisted, and I think the way that all this is being negotiated is also so fundamentally undermining the whole notion of an international human rights regime.
Thank you so much, Helen. I don't know if anyone wanted to, I'm taking your notes there. I don't know if anyone wanted to answer the question on Irina's question on the use of or involvement of private military companies at the border. Maybe Melissa or Scott, if you've got, Angela. Got it.
And I thought that was a great question. The direct answer as to private security operating at the US-Mexico border, less than you would imagine, but that's not to say none. And I'm going to talk about this in a couple of different ways. It really is US officials on US soil refouling people back to their own persecution. And we emphasize that in our case. However, there are many notable exceptions to that. Number one, in the interior of the country, Border Patrol regularly works with private security, including militias, famous for their white nationalist violence. Texas, a couple of years ago, took it upon themselves to institute their own, and unconstitutional, I might add, their own immigration enforcement measures. But the real, and Mexico, of course, Mexico uses NGOs and private security as well to pre-screen individuals who can come to the line to apply for asylum in the first place. But the thing that I'd like to talk about very briefly is that in the same ways in which Edwin described the extortion of smaller, less wealthy countries to do the United States bidding of the unwanted populations we have, as cool as you can imagine that, major Western states outsource and force smaller countries' hands to do the pre-screening for them. And I refer to things like Operation Plan Sur, things like the Merida Initiative, which are hemispherically in the Western Hemisphere, Central American, South American, and Mexican countries, pre-screen migrants, preventing them from crossing state lines before they ever even get close to the US-Mexico border. It was so effective, in fact, in some instances, the United States launched what it called CBP-1, which was a mobile application to remove US officials' involvement in the pre-screening process and allow people in the south of Mexico or in Mexico City to apply for asylum and have their applications, their appointment to be inspected and processed heard. And that's subject to litigation as well. We'll be getting in that soon. But what I'd like to talk about also is that this isn't just a US phenomenon of hiring other countries or private entities to do your bidding for you. In fact, Italy famously used Libya to do its pre-screening, which led to the deaths of thousands of individuals in the Mediterranean. Turkey assumed that role on behalf of the EU, and it's one major part of the externalization of the border problem, in which wealthier Western states, who I might add have the responsibility for destabilizing many of the countries from which people flee, are asking similar countries to do their work in preventing individuals from accessing their international legal human rights. So it's kind of a complicated web. There's not really as much private security as you might like maybe in an airport or something. But that doesn't mean that they're not inventing machinations to reach the same goals.
Thank you so much. There are,
Oh,
go on, Helen.
no, there were several other times.
Yeah, yeah.
Very good one.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So I was going to ask if anyone wants to come in on the two last questions. One was on the racial aspects of these policies and how we can fight them. And there was also a question on how migrant communities are saying we shouldn't be letting more migrant communities in, and what we could respond to that statement, and also how we can get involved to support migrants in the community. So I just wanted to check in with others if anyone wanted to come in on those two questions.
I'll come in on
I
the
can
last
see.
one.
Yeah.
I was already venting on last, the earlier one, so I'll shut up on that topic. But on
Go
the
for it, Helen.
question of, migrant communities feeling overwhelmed or feeling numbers. I mean, I live in a very immigrant community myself, and that is certainly a sentiment that one hears at the bus stop. I think there are several things that should be appreciated here. One is that the phenomenon historically of immigrants here feeling like, the ladder should have been pulled up soon after they got here. That's a known phenomenon that exists in most countries, right? That said, I think that this is partly responsive to a sense of like the very visible presence of very recently arrived people on the streets of certain cities, including New York in particular, and the fact that, for example, the way that the US, the way New York City was located, its shelter system in particular, means that presence is a lot more visible in some neighborhoods than others. One of the things that I found deeply upsetting about the Biden administration was their cowardice, to be frank, and the fact that a lot of the people who should have been out there advocating for a fair system fundamentally didn't have the courage of their convictions. And I'm talking here about political appointees for the most part. It does not help to be running scared from an issue that you supposedly believe in, like fair access to asylum in the United States, right? And I think that when you allow the framing that this is a problem to be adopted, it sets the stage for people being left to sort out solutions for themselves on their own, for cities that are more welcoming to, end up receiving a disproportionate number of people. And to me, it seemed to me that, especially in the demographic state of the United States, that this was such a missed opportunity. Like, why didn't you have somebody in the White House whose job it was, for example, to interact with local chambers of commerce, with state governments, to say, who is looking for employees, have some sort of a central screening mechanism at the border. It's like, hey, if you've got carpentry skills, there's this locality that has a bunch of openings. I mean, immigrants sort themselves out this way naturally anyway, right? And the people your neighbors are seeing in the Bronx, very often they're in the Bronx for a bit, and then next thing you know, they're in North Carolina because they found a job. So I think that's the other thing that communities need to realize, is that a lot of this is people cycling through while they find their feet. But we could be doing so much more to help them find their feet, right? And it's frustrating because, I mean, the reason to be providing protection against refoulement to people and providing them with lasting security here is because they're humans and they have that as a right, not because they're useful. But for Pete's sake, they're also very useful. You're talking about a bunch of really talented human beings. I mean, you'd see people in these camps in Matamoros, and you'd have doctors, you'd have nurse practitioners, you'd have carpenters, you'd have these guys who grew up in Central America, like in very difficult circumstances, who can basically do anything. Like, can you fix a car? I can fix a car. Can you build me a wall? You can build a wall. And a lot of these guys, once they got into the United States, I mean, they were employed the second they set foot in their new communities. And, you know, in jobs that were paying actual money in many cases. That's the thing. So it's like, well, if we have this capacity to absorb, why could we not actually get out in front of this? But to get out in front of this, you actually have to believe that this matters. You actually have to believe that this can be good for everybody, right? That this is not some zero-sum game. So, I mean, to me, the path of the future is to actually make those points and get people elected who are willing to get out there and make those points, because it's true. I mean, there are so many communities in this country whose only commercial liveliness, you know, is based on the fact that some random group of immigrants decided to settle there at one point. And this then ends up benefiting the native population, right? But you don't, unless you're willing to actually say that, then you're going to be constantly in this bad reactive mode.
Thanks. I totally agree and have just a very brief a personal anecdote about infighting between immigrant groups and the other oppressed peoples of this country. I'm a native Miamian. My dad arrived on the Maria boat lift in 1980, in which 125,000 Cubans in about a year, maybe a little less, arrived, overwhelming the city, in addition to the thousands that had arrived in the 1970s, as well as the Haitians who fled the Duvalier dictatorship. And there was the main topic in 1980, other than the race riots, Colombian cocaine influx, was what are we going to do with all these new people, because there's not enough resources for them. Number one, most labor studies have shown that even such a mass influx had almost no effect on the labor market at all. Jobs hiring stayed steady. Number two, there was actually some really great community building between those darker skinned Cubans, Haitians who had fled, and the existing Black community to join together. And I want to emphasize that the United States could treat its immigrants better. And I mean that specifically, it could care for them with financial supplements, as they did the very first Miami Cubans under the Cuban Adjustment Act. When they arrived in the 1960s and 70s, they got flown into the United States. They got moving expenses, healthcare, educational expenses, living stipends, housing stipends. I could go on. It was amazing to read about the physical amount of assistance given to immigrants who had recently arrived, and to hear stuff like what Stephen and Teddy have to go through, not even have an adjudication heard. It is not a resource problem. It is a United States doesn't care problem, right? And so I really want to emphasize that solidarity is best wherever possible, and to resist the easy temptation to say that there's not enough pie to go around.
Like to make one comment on the pie. Since I've been talking trash about the Biden administration, one thing they did that was good. Was okay, they did some other things that were good. The border was not one of those things. But one thing that they did do that was good, including in the context of the border, was speeding up people's access to work permits when they had pending asylum claims. And when they, with some fumbling around in connection with pending TPS applications as well. And I think that was critically important, because although there are definitely situations where access to active material assistance can be very nice, most of the people that we deal with just want to be able to work and to do that legally. And that's a need that I think is psychological as well as material. It helps people start feeling like real humans again. It helps them be the source of sustenance for their families in a way that's really important in terms of rebuilding a life after displacement. It gives them access to driver's licenses, social security numbers, you know, all kinds of bank accounts and all kinds of other things that make your life safer and better. And that is something that, you know, this administration is also really trying to undermine, and it's regrettable because doing this properly costs the United States nothing, but it has enormous material impacts on people. I mean, you know, I've seen clients who are able to actually buy houses as a result of, I mean, places where many of us would perhaps choose not to live, but nonetheless, an actual house that actually belongs to them with a roof on it. And based on the fact that they were immediately able to get work authorization and start working.
Can you hear me? Yes. I wanted to briefly address the racial issue and xenophobia. Just going back to the case for the moment, one of the most inane arguments that the government made before the Supreme Court is that people who are just over the Mexican side of the border and are asking for asylum don't need access to the US asylum process because there is a separate process under a different provision of the Immigration and Nationality Act that provides for overseas refugee processing. So if you are not physically present in the United States, you should just go through overseas refugee processing in Mexico. Number one, there has been no overseas processing in Mexico for quite some time. Number two, the only people who are getting processed right now and outside the country and then allowed in by the Trump administration are white South Africans. So there is clearly a racial overtone or undertone to our current immigration policy, and it needs to be called out more than it has been.
Can I speak to the politics of this issue? Since I've dealt with a lot of politicians around this issue. There are a small handful of politicians who are compassionate and thoughtful and responsive to rational arguments around these things, but it's a small handful. Politicians are politicians because they depend on getting reelected, and they are generally responsive to constituent pressure. And this is a hard issue because there isn't a huge constituency of voters pressing politicians to do better on this. So, I mean, this is why the Turning Back campaign is great, to try to build that political pressure, but politicians are not going to come up with good solutions unless they feel like their own survival depends on taking the right position on these issues. So it's up to folks in this room to be going to their representatives and saying, here's what I think needs to happen and here's why. And eventually, if there are enough of those voices, politicians may switch. The Biden administration, part of the problem of the Biden administration and even Kamala Harris was there were some people with progressive, compassionate views within the industry. There are other hardliners who felt like voters out there want the border to be secure. Voters want us to crack down. The immigration bill that was negotiated in the Senate that Kamala Harris endorsed was actually an incredibly restrictive bill when it came to asylum. Again, because they weren't feeling the political pressure. So I mean, you have wonderful experiences in your community, and sharing those with your elected representatives, I think, is super important, along with others in the room here.
So just to jump in quickly, because this is such an important conversation. In the microwave. Okay, I'm out of the microwave. So just to jump in on this, because I think this is the conversation. I mean, the political economy of these kinds of questions, I think is where we all have to be. There's a reason, for instance, that every single honest economic analysis that I'm aware of showcases that refugees and migrants are an economic benefit, and it does not matter politically. There's a reason that migrants and refugees are scapegoated for problems. It is a deflection. It is a deflection on the fact that, for instance, that as inequality rises, as wealth gets sucked upwards, you need a downward pressure to keep kind of the masses in check and keep them essentially fighting among themselves. I think this is more or less what we're talking about. And so this idea that migrants and refugees, they bring crime. Every single honest study shows no, they don't. And we know this. And yet we're in this loggerhead, right? Like the economic data is on our side, the crime data is on our side. All of the actual scientific data is on our side, and we get nowhere. And I think in part that's because we're not focused on who's pulling these strings, who's benefiting from this corrupt, awful, inhumane system, illegal system. Who's benefiting from this? And I think until we attach the kind of the oligarchy to these kinds of things, we can't get anywhere because the data's on our side. Again, all of the honest studies are there. You can read them, we can send them to you. It doesn't matter though, it doesn't filter into the political zeitgeist. Why do people still seem to be blaming the wrong people? I think this isn't I think this is the question, really. And I think in part it's because we're not blaming the people at the top, the people that have an interest in these kinds of narratives going forward. They often come to the great conferences. They have, they don't have the data. I mean, but they have their own sort of data. But until we link up what's going on at the top and what's going on at the bottom, so to say, I don't think we can get anywhere. But if we do, then the whole world opens up because every single study shows that we need more migration, especially I'm from Vermont, where we compete with Maine, who's the oldest state in the country. It's a back and forth, but I think, whatever. Vermont and Maine, we need people. We need people, right? We absolutely need people. The United States, in 30 years, my hopeful vision is that the politics, and we can kind of get out of our kind of oligarchic system, but the politics of this is that the traditional countries that are shutting their doors, that are slamming their doors, that are saying asylum doesn't exist anymore, are the exact same countries that are going to need people. And that there will be a race to the top rather than a race to the bottom. My warning to those countries, including this one, is that people will remember how you treated their brother, their sister, their father, their mother, and they're going to go elsewhere. They're going to go to the countries that actually welcomed them. And if we don't start welcoming people now, just crassly at a kind of economic and demographic level, let alone the morality and the legality of it, but just at the kind of, the crude level, if we don't start welcoming people now, and we have the demographic crisis that we know is coming in the sort of, whether we call it the West or the global North, or, and different countries will be hit differently, but we're barreling towards a demographic crisis. And if we think we're going to AI ourselves or robot ourselves out of it, I'm sorry, but we're not. And people are going to remember, and they're going to go to the countries that we're welcoming today. And so we're just setting ourselves up for a very, very kind of dismal, dystopian demographic decline that I don't think is part of this conversation. It ought to be, because if we can't convince them on the legality, the morality, the economics, any other thing, the demographics ought to be a big part of this. And it isn't. But anyway, I'm rambling, but that's what I got from.
Thank you, Leah. That really, really resonates with me. And I wonder, just building on the specific question, if someone came to you and said, we shouldn't let any more migrants into this country, how would you frame what you just said in kind of simple terms to that person? Because I think that we often do lose ourselves in the evidence, the reports that are clearly showing that migrants are valuable to our communities, and we need them in our countries and our world. And so what would you say to the migrant that comes up to the lady in the audience that asks the question and says, we don't need any more migrants in the country, or to the American that says that?
All right, just so, because I'm gonna then pass this on to everybody else, but I would just say, look at our demographics, think 30 years ahead. It writes itself, and we would be absolutely crazy not to be racing to the top. People vote with their feet, and they will not be voting to come to the United States in 30 years.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone else also wants to answer that question, and then I've got one last question for everyone.
I mean, virtually every person in this country has interactions with immigrants, whether they're cleaning houses or cleaning, cutting your grass, serving you at the local food stand. But when the issue isn't posed in the abstract to people, they say, oh, we need to keep immigrants. So I think it's very important to personalize the issue by asking people, who are the immigrants in your lives and what are they doing for you? Because most people have positive experiences with immigrants, and pulling it back to that very basic personal level, I think is valuable.
Just to piggyback on that, my theory is that to really explain what it would mean to not have a substantial immigrant community. First of all, we are a nation of immigrants, like we are all immigrants from somewhere. But years ago, there was a day without immigrants that, it was a symbolic effort intended to make a statement, and lots of immigrant workers didn't go to work, and, that was fine. I think there needs to be at least a month without immigrants that needs to be funded by some wealthy foundation so that these people can actually be paid while not working. To show people exactly what Scott was saying, that their lives are directly impacted, whether they know it or not. And it's not just the low skilled workers, it's the healthcare workers and the nurses and the IT people. And I mean, the list goes on. But it's going to take a revolution, to go back to Bella's book.
I think another aspect of this is that when I started doing this work in the US, the very late 90s, one of the interesting things about the United States was that no one really knew what an asylum seeker was. There was anti-immigrant prejudice in these circles, but it wasn't focused on asylum seekers as a class. It wasn't focused on them as like a subset of anything else particularly. And I think that has really changed in the last few years. And the positive side of that is that I guess people now have some clue that there's a thing called refugee protection. Okay, great. The downside of that is they're not necessarily doing with that knowledge what we would all hope, right? And I think that this focus on asylum in particular is also a result of the fact that the United States has not had a broad-based regularization program for undocumented immigrants since 1986, right? I mean, that is, well, we haven't. I mean, you can say NACARA, but like seriously, like we haven't had like a broad-based thing. And so, and that's weird. That's off. I mean, I at one point remember a friend of friends getting detained in Maine, actually, speaking of underpopulated states. He was an asylum seeker from Rwanda, and he had been here for a few months at that point, and he decided that he was uncomfortable being in the United States with any fixed status, so he would march into the DMV and ask for documents, because from what he gathered from talking to people, because again, we're not a super organized country in terms of like, do we know your rights for new arrivals? That was where you got documents. So as you can imagine, he ended up getting arrested as a result of this attempt to regularize himself. And as a result of that, indirectly, he ended up getting asylum. It was just like more painful than it needed to be. But my point is that we don't actually have a process for people to simply come forward and say, I've been here for quite a while, and I think you want me and I want you, and can we just maybe make this official? And at the same time, we have a population that is overwhelmingly convinced that this is a thing, right? So, I mean, I think one of the things that drives all asylum lawyers and refugee lawyers generally completely wiggy is having to deal with fellow citizens who are like, well, he's been here all this time and he never bothered to apply for citizenship. And you're just like, oh. First of all, you don't just go from like no papers to citizenship. And I mean, this happens to those of us, half of whose families were not US citizens. Like these same misperceptions persist. And so I don't know what you do about the information, which is completely crazy, right? I mean, there is so much deliberate misunderstanding or like persistent misunderstanding of the very basics of the system. And so I think that aside, in addition to Melissa's fabulous billionaire initiative, it would also be great to have someone like maybe skywrite over the Super Bowl phrases like "there is no line," and maybe that would like stimulate a national conversation.
I think I'd like to add that I meet a lot of these people. The hypothetical person that says, well, there's too many migrants and you can't let anybody in. I talk to them a lot. A lot of them are driving Ubers, they're just hanging out. I say the same thing to them all the time. Tell me the borders you had to cross and why. And they say, oh, okay, they're in Texas, they've been in New Mexico. And I say, did anyone stop and check your papers? They say, no. I say, well, do the New Mexicans, are they a little different? Do they have different customs? Do they sometimes come and work in Texas and maybe you don't like that? And he says, yeah. And I say, well, nobody ever does anything about it because nobody cares. Implicit in the US-Mexico border and the Department of Homeland Security is the idea that people from other countries are inherently worth less, that they have less to contribute, that they are inherently dangerous, criminalized, they need to be othered. And I rebuke and reject that in the strongest terms, mainly because my father came from Cuba, but also because I'm a human being and know that like there are circumstances that determine your character, and where you are born is not one of them. And so I would really urge everyone here to rethink the border crisis and the immigration issue by asking yourself, are there borders that you can't cross? The kind of guy that I asked probably has 3. Iran, Russia, and North Korea, and he doesn't have to worry about a damn one of them because he can walk into Mexico, Tijuana, Nogales, Ciudad Juarez, and do whatever the hell he wants. And someone who is dying in destitution with their family cannot even get an interview to decide whether they can stay for a few months. I think that's the right question.
Absolutely, Angela. Absolutely, Angela, and thank you. I'm now gonna. I promised everyone that we will get out by 7, and it is 7. But I want to end on a hopeful note. So I just have one more question to all our panelists, which is, what gives you hope in this moment? And if you can answer it in 2 to 3 sentences, that would be excellent, so that we can all get out and get some vitamin D, which is also important to us keeping hope. So I'd love to start with Stephen or Teddy, who haven't spoken for a while. So over to you.
Thank you. What gives me hope? Moments like this one really gives me hope because having people like you to come and listen, contribute, and represent the many people out there who are going through, hard times. It's very important for me. But also having the opportunity for me to come and share on this space, representing the many immigrants out there who are desperate in various ways. That's really very important. But also seeing so many immigrants who are very resilient, despite the ongoing chaos in this country. I see them every day in small circles, celebrating, feasting. That gives me hope.
Thank you so much.
For me, being on this panelist today also meet all of you guys. I just want to say thank you for fighting for people like us when we have same color, but we are also the same human. And thank you all so much for coming today. And we're just hoping that in a couple of months of years, America will be like a dream that I've been dreaming before, the American dream. So yeah, once again, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Teddy. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in. Please, sentences.
I would say the bravery and courage and indomitable spirit of the people that we represent. I didn't get a chance to talk about some of the more grassroots pieces of our case. But there were a number of times at critical moments where we would schedule Zoom conversations with migrants on the other side of the border who were waiting to come in. And they didn't give up. I mean, this case has been going on for 9 years. But they wanted to be heard. It's exactly what Stephen was talking about. They wanted to be seen and heard, and they were really grateful that we wanted to listen to them. So it's the people that we're fighting for, and the amazing community of people that we're fighting with, that gives me hope.
Very similar. I was with a group of unaccompanied minors last night who my wife is doing some work with, and their positivity in the face of all these hurdles was really inspiring. And I have to say that the defeat of Viktor Orban as well is a very hopeful note. You know, I at least believed he was gonna stick around forever, at least until he died, and that he had put everything, and of course, part of his message on which the Trump administration has also relied is an anti-immigrant message. Now, I don't know whether the new government in Hungary will be especially more welcoming than Viktor Orban was, but I do think it's a signal that people can come together and defeat these authoritarian oriented regimes if they are unified enough and energetic enough.
And also perhaps that people really don't like corruption very much when that gets shoved in their faces over a period of years and to a long enough degree. And so perhaps if we don't win on principle, we'll win on like, come on, do you want to live like this? So I guess that's one hopeful thing. Yes. Peaceful transfers of power give me hope always. So.
New York gives me hope. You know what I mean? We got people from everywhere, all over, and we're all just trying to make it in our own way together. And finally, we got someone in office who's trying to make that just a little bit easier. You know, and I think that if the world were a little bit more like New York, maybe it would be a better place.
Okay, all right, positivity. No, I take solace in that things are so bad that they must get better. But also, that geopolitically things are changing, and I don't know about any of you, but I you know, for the past month I wake up and I feel a bit paralyzed. I look at the news and I feel more paralyzed. But we're watching world history change right now. And we don't know where it's gonna go. But things are changing very, very rapidly. And I have hope that they may end up better than where we are at the very kind of macro geopolitical level. I think until that happens, the rest of us are going to be very, very busy, and we all need a break. So I'm very hopeful that that we're we're definitely barreling into a new world order. I don't know exactly what it's going to be, but I am optimistic about. Couldn't be worse, right?
Thank you so much, Leah, and everyone else. And I just add that, yeah, community, like all of you here today, and everyone in the audience gives me hope. My team working around the world on these issues tirelessly, day in, day out, give me hope. And as Melissa said, our clients, who are incredibly resilient, and people like Stephen and Teddy give me hope every day as well. I do believe that most people in the world want justice and believe in humanity, and it's just that the power currently sits in the hands of a few. But the revolution may not be litigated, but it will happen. And I hope that we can leave this event thankful to all our panelists and with a little bit of hope for the future in the face of austerity and injustice. Thank you so much, everyone, for having me today. And I'm so sorry it's 7:08, but the sun is still out till 7:30. So thank you.